Welcome to today's explainer class. We're diving straight into the administrative mechanics of the British Empire. And I want you to just pause and think about the sheer scale of this for a second. How exactly did a relatively small, rain-swept island nation build the kind of administrative machinery needed to govern a quarter of the globe? We're talking about a third of the world's population here. This wasn't just a matter of, putting some ships in the water and hoping for the best. It required incredibly complex and honestly highly experimental forms of governance. So, looking at today's syllabus, we've got 5 main stops. We'll start with the 3 models of empire, look at the shift to crown rule, explore the massive post-America strategic pivot, dig into the wild East India Company anomaly, and finally wrap up with the transition from company to crown.
All right, part 1, 3 models of empire. Let's categorize how early colonial governance actually worked. So, when the English crown really started looking outward, think back to the reigns of Queen Elizabeth I and King James, they absolutely didn't have some grand, monolithic master plan. They kind of just experimented. Overseas territories generally fell into one of 3 distinct frameworks: crown colonies, charter colonies, and proprietary colonies. And as you'll see, each of these models carried vastly different economic and political implications, both for the settlers trying to survive on the ground and the administrators sitting comfortably back in London. First up, the crown colony. This is exactly what it sounds like, the ultimate expression of direct state sovereignty. The monarch was literally in charge here, projecting royal power across the ocean through a hand-picked governor and a local council. It's a structure specifically designed to ensure that whatever the territory produced, geopolitically or economically, went straight into serving the centralized interests of the state.
Next, we have the charter colonies. Now, these functioned under a corporate agreement, or a charter, rather than direct royal decree. Because the crown actually decentralized its authority here, delegating it out to specific groups, the settlers paradoxically ended up enjoying significantly more political liberty. They got to establish their own local self-governance on the ground, which ended up creating these really fascinating early cultures of legislative independence.
And finally, proprietary colonies. You can think of these as basically privatized colonial ventures. They were commercial enterprises governed by an individual, very often the head of a joint stock company. And their primary responsibility, it wasn't to the king's geopolitical strategy at all. It was to their shareholders' wallets. Now, it looked like a highly profitable model on paper, but in practice, it was incredibly volatile and super difficult to control.
Which brings us to section 2, the shift to crown rule, or the harsh reality of colonial management.
Because, as you might guess, the theory of private colonial enterprise completely clashed with reality. I mean, relying on absentee proprietors who only care about shareholder profit, it totally lacked the stability and, frankly, the direct military backing of the state. Trying to effectively govern a territory from thousands of miles away turned out to be exceedingly difficult without formal royal infrastructure. This constant friction forced a gradual but totally inevitable transition. The British government quickly realized they had to convert a lot of these volatile commercial territories into direct crown colonies, just to maintain basic administrative control.
Just look at the history. It's literally littered with the disastrous risks of private, poorly planned ventures. Take 1585, the first English colony at Roanoke. It fails dramatically, and the settlers just vanish. By the early 1600s, state-backed initiatives like the Plantation of Ulster were providing a much more organized blueprint for colonization. But the absolute starkest warning came in 1698 with Scotland's Darien scheme in Panama. It was intended to control oceanic trade, but it completely collapsed into starvation and disease. And get this, it consumed almost a fifth of Scotland's total wealth. The financial ruin was so immense, it practically forced Scotland into the 1707 Acts of Union with England. That right there proves the deep geopolitical necessity of organized state-backed administration.
All right, section 3, the post-America strategic pivot. Time to redraw the imperial map.
So after an exhausting 8-year war, Britain loses its absolute most prized Atlantic possessions. In 1783, the United States is officially born, and losing America marked a literal sea change. The entire imperial strategy had to be essentially torn up and rewritten from scratch to compensate for what was, at the time, an unprecedented geopolitical defeat. With westward expansion completely cut off, explorers like Captain James Cook shifted the empire's gaze entirely toward Asia, the Pacific, and Africa. Back home, losing their American dumping grounds for convicts sparked an urgent prison crisis. The Crown's creative solution? Establish brand new penal colonies like New South Wales in 1788.
And maybe most importantly, having learned a really bitter lesson about taxation, representation, and revolution, administrators actually started evolving their governance models. They slowly began granting self-governance to predominantly white settler colonies. This formed dominions like Canada in 1867 and Australia in 1900, which was basically a strategy to ensure loyalty without using the heavy hand of direct rule. Which brings us perfectly to Section 4, the East India Company anomaly, the corporate state.
Now this is wild. While the Crown is busy licking its wounds from the American Revolution and tweaking its state apparatus, an entirely different type of administration is busy conquering the Indian subcontinent. Founded way back in 1600, the British East India Company grew into this monstrous corporate anomaly. Technically, it wasn't even part of the formal empire, yet it operated as a state unto itself. How? Well, by pursuing enormous colonial interests using its own massive private armies. It operated completely outside those standard crown, charter, or proprietary models we talked about earlier.
Just look at the stark contrast here between these parallel empires. Crown governments that relied on direct royal rule and the actual state military to expand national sovereignty. The East India Company, on the other hand, answered only to a corporate board of directors. They utilized private mercenary armies and managed the locals through company officials or straight-up puppet rulers. Their primary goal wasn't national pride or imperial expansion for the state at all. It was strictly to enforce mercantile monopolies and extract staggering amounts of wealth for shareholder profit.
And that leads us to our final section, Part 5, From Company to Crown, the End of Corporate Rule.
Because, unsurprisingly, this corporate anomaly completely shattered in 1857. The Sepoy Rebellion kicked off, and local troops violently mutinied against their British corporate commanders. Now, while the company did fiercely fight back and reclaim the territory, the British government finally stepped in. London looked at the situation and determined, right, there's no way a private corporation can hold a massive subcontinent indefinitely without catastrophic consequences. So in 1858, the East India Company is formally dissolved due to sheer mismanagement, and India gets absorbed directly under British rule, famously becoming the jewel in the crown.
Now, fast forward through the 20th century to absolutely devastating world wars and the massive wave of global decolonization. Today, the remnants of this once vast administrative machine have condensed down to just 14 overseas territories where the British government still holds power. And that leaves us with this final thought. Today, English is the most widely spoken language on Earth, and Britain itself is a diverse microcosm of the peoples it once ruled. So how did the sheer variety of these global administrative experiments, from private charters to massive corporate armies, and eventually to crown dominions, ultimately forge the political and cultural borders of the modern world we live in today? It's a huge question, right? Keep that in mind as you review your notes from this explainer and keep digging into the history. See you next time!